My name is Nick Collier, and speaking of names, if you've heard the name Bob Dylan, chances are it's in conversation about the way his voice sounds or how his songs have been covered by hundreds of well-known artists. His influence is vast. Your parents and grandparents will agree. But what makes this man's career, his writing, and his life so interesting to the industry? The truth is that Bob Dylan, whose birth name is Robert Allen Zimmerman, has always had his convictions, and even under the watchful eye of the general public, has held those views close to his heart. You see, while he's just one man, Dylan has held his ground against the philosophies of a nation going to war, the suffocating presence of the press, and an oppressive and unjust society. In the late 50s and through to the 70s, the baby boomer population grew up into a war-stricken America once more. Children born after World War II were experiencing the start of the Vietnam War, and this time things were different. With the often divisive violence involving unarmed Vietnamese civilians and the growing threat of nuclear weapons, there was an extreme escalation that was already costing the lives of millions on both sides. Some were not sitting idly by. There was an anti-war movement and uprising led by free thinkers, politicians, public figures, and, believe it or not, musicians. Senator Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. were some of the more well-known figures in the traditional political realm, but Dylan himself, Joan Baez, Phil Ochs, and Nina Simone were some of the most notable musicians. They often attended mass protests, growing the genre that became known as protest music, to unite a crowd with a common goal. Bob Dylan sings to the American elite in one of these songs released in 1963. While it isn't the same as listening, I'd like to read to you a chilling verse from his song, Masters of War. You fasten all the triggers for the others to fire, then you sit back and watch, while the death count gets higher. You hide in your mansion while the young people's blood flows out of their bodies and is buried in the mud. His participation in this movement didn't go unnoticed. In fact, because of the recognition the young songwriter received, Dylan became greatly revered and respected. This kind of attention can be draining and invasive, though, and he notoriously made little to no effort to give the interviewers the answers they were looking for out of principle. As a result of this, you'll notice I didn't start this speech with a long retelling of the singer's childhood. He never had an open book relationship with his personal life and the public eye. For a celebrity of his size and stature at the time, the world knew shockingly little about the real Robert Allen Zimmerman. Instead, what we know is the art he creates and the causes he campaigns for. When he was asked about if he saw his songs as being quote-unquote protest songs, Dylan said this: I think all my stuff is protest material in some kind of way. I always felt like my position and my place came after that first wave or maybe second wave of rock and roll. In the context of this interview, this isn't the answer Rolling Stone reporter Kurt Loder was looking for, but it's hardly an example of Dylan's habit of toying with the press. In fact, because of this often bitter relationship with media in general, until recent years, in interviews surrounding his Nobel Prize in Literature and Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award, this is one of the only examples of Dylan playing along. In many interviews, when asked about his writing process, he would often simply say things like, "It just seemed like the right words to say," or "It came to me in a dream." I'd like to talk to you about Rubin Hurricane Carter. Carter was an award-winning middleweight prize fighter in the 60s with a bright future. But on June 17, 1966, there was a shooting at Lafayette Bar and Grill in New Jersey, causing the death of the bartender and 2 customers. Despite being miles away at the time of the crime and not being identified as a suspect by either of the 2 wounded eyewitnesses, Carter was convicted of the triple homicide. Now, the only resemblance he shared with the eyewitness's description was his race and gender. Even though the murder weapon was never found, Carter spent the next 19 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. Dylan's attention was drawn to the then closed case, and he wrote the song Hurricane in 1975. It was a retelling of the night and its outcomes, and more importantly, the injustices and inconsistencies in the justice system during this case. Rubin Carter was released via a writ of habeas corpus and a petition 10 years after the song's release, and he died of natural causes as a freed man just a few years ago. This isn't the first time, or the only time, Dylan spoke out against injustice in a government system. In an episode of his radio show, the Theme Time Radio Hour, titled Rich Man, Poor Man, Bob Dylan spends the entire hour educating his listeners on the injustice of systemic poverty between playing songs from all the way back to the 30s that mention this topic of the dichotomy between the rich and the poor. Now, the last important moment of Dylan's life I'll discuss, and undoubtedly the most iconic, was his participation in the March on Washington in 1963. Standing alongside fellow protest singer Joan Baez, Dylan performed legendary songs such as Only a Pawn in Their Game and Blowin' in the Wind before Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech. This day was a leap in the right direction towards fair economic and civil treatment of the African American population. Bob Dylan was a man of conviction and never let up when it came to injustices, whether on a national scale, a personal invasion of privacy, or the cruelty of a flawed judicial system. While his presence to the modern researcher can be cryptic, I hope you've learned something today, as I did during my own personal research. Listening to his songs since has given me a brand new perspective, and I'd like to leave you with a quote from the campaign of the Nobel Prize, one of the few times we see a window into his mind, where he says, "Our songs are alive in the land of the living, but songs are unlike literature. They're meant to be sung, not read. The words in Shakespeare's plays were meant to be acted on the stage, just as lyrics in songs are meant to be sung, not read on a page." And I hope some of you get the chance to listen to these lyrics the way they were intended to be heard, in concert or on record, or however people are listening to songs these days. Thank you.